The man across the room was not a guest. He was a king holding court in a kingdom of shadows. Sophia Bennett watched him from behind the relative safety of a marble column, the cold stone a welcome anchor in the swirling sea of silk, champagne, and gilded masks. The air in the Palazzo Pisani Moretta was thick with the scent of lilies and something ancient, the faint, dusty perfume of stone and secrets. It was an intoxicating, suffocating mix. Her simple velvet mask felt heavy, a flimsy shield in a room full of predators wearing porcelain smiles. She was an art historian, a restorer. Her world was one of patient silence, the gentle scrape of a scalpel against centuries of grime, the quiet whisper of a brush coaxing life back into a faded canvas. This was a different world entirely. A world of noise and power plays so subtle they were like currents beneath the smooth surface of the Grand Canal outside. And that man, Luca De Luca, was the heart of the storm. He didn't move much. He didn't have to. The crowd parted for him, a magnetic repulsion and attraction all at once. Men in suits that cost more than her London flat approached him with deferential bows of their heads, their laughter a little too loud, their eyes a little too bright with fear. Women, draped in jewels that caught the chandelier light like captured stars, watched him with a mixture of hunger and terror. He was tall, dressed in a black suit so perfectly tailored it seemed poured onto his frame. His mask was simple, black and unadorned, but it couldn't hide the sharp line of his jaw or the intense, unsettling stillness of his posture. He looked like a panther that had decided for the moment not to hunt. "Isn't it magnificent, Sophia?" Mr. Albright, the museum director, whispered beside her, his cheeks flushed with Prosecco. "To be in the presence of such history, such influence." Sophia nodded, her throat dry. "It's overwhelming." She was here for one reason. Mr. Albright's Italian was passable for ordering dinner, but not for negotiating the delicate details of their museum's new partnership. She was his linguistic crutch, a necessary tool for the evening. Her deepest desire was to be invisible, to observe and then retreat back to her quiet studio. But her eyes kept betraying her, drawn back to De Luca. It was the way he listened, his head tilted just so, his gaze never wavering from whoever was speaking. He absorbed everything, his silence more potent than any shout. Her nonna's voice echoed in her memory, a soft, urgent whisper from her childhood. "Ci sono uomini in Italia, Sofia, che sono come le statue antiche. Belli da vedere, ma fatti di pietra dura. Non toccarli mai, tesoro mio. Non lasciare che ti tocchino." There are men in Italy, Sophia, who are like the ancient statues, beautiful to look at but made of hard stone. Never touch them, my treasure. Don't let them touch you. Nonna had been full of such warnings, stories of a homeland she'd fled but never stopped loving. She had poured her language into Sophia, not just the beautiful, lyrical Italian of Dante, but the rough, earthy dialects of the streets, the coded words of the villages. "La lingua è la tua armatura," she'd say. "Language is your armor." Tonight, Sophia felt less armored and more like a snail ripped from its shell. Then, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It was a subtle drop in pressure, a change in the quality of the light. Another man approached Luca De Luca's circle. This one was different. He was shorter, broader, with a face that seemed perpetually locked in a sneer. His mask was ornate, gold with a long, mocking nose like a plague doctor from a nightmare. The whispers around Sophia changed tone, a new name breathed into the air like a curse. Vittorio Ricci. The two men stood face to face, the air between them crackling. The polite chatter around them died down, creating a pocket of silence that was louder than the music. Sophia felt a primal urge to run, to push through the crowd and find the nearest exit. Mr. Albright, oblivious, nudged her forward. "Ah, here we go. We need to speak with Signor De Luca about the final arrangements." "Perhaps we should wait," Sophia murmured, her hand instinctively clutching the small satin bag at her side. But it was too late. The confrontation had already begun.
Luca De Luca despised these events. He hated the cloying perfume, the false smiles, the desperate grasping for favor that clung to him like humidity. Each person who approached him wanted something: a contract, a blessing, a stay of execution. He was a confessor for a city of sinners, and he was tired of their litanies. His gaze swept the ballroom, cataloging, dismissing. His right hand, Marco, stood just behind his left shoulder, a silent, unmoving mountain. The only thing of interest in the entire suffocating room was the art. A Veronese here, a Tintoretto there. They were silent, honest witnesses to centuries of Venetian intrigue. They understood power. They understood blood. They, unlike the people, did not lie. Then he saw her. She was standing near a far column, half hidden in the shadows. She wasn't like the other women. They were preening, displaying themselves like exotic birds. She was trying to fold into herself, to become part of the marble. Her dress was a simple, elegant dark blue, her mask plain black velvet. She held herself with a quiet tension, her eyes, the only part of her truly visible, darting around the room, taking everything in. They were intelligent eyes, analytical, and wary. She looked like a scholar who had wandered into a den of wolves. He'd watched her for 10 minutes, intrigued by the anomaly she presented. She didn't belong, which begged the question, why was she here? His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a peacock. Vittorio Ricci, his face obscured by a gaudy, ridiculous mask, strutted into his space. The air grew cold. The Ricci family were jackals, nipping at the heels of the De Luca lion for generations. They were loud, crude, and greedy. De Luca, Vittorio began, his voice a low sneer. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He switched to the old dialect, the guttural, blade-sharp tongue of their forefathers. A language for threats and blood oaths, not for polite company. Hai preso qualcosa che non è tuo. You have taken something that is not yours. Luca's jaw tightened. He kept his own voice level, a low rumble that cut through Vittorio's whine. Parli di spazzatura, Ricci. Come sempre. You speak of garbage, Ricci. As always. He felt Marco tense behind him. The few people close enough to understand the dialect took a nervous step back. This was not for public consumption. Don't play the fool, Vittorio spat, his voice rising. Il velato. La nostra storia. L'hai rubata come un ladro nella notte. The veiled one. Our history. You stole it like a thief in the night. He was talking about the painting. The veiled allegory. A masterpiece lost for a century, rumored to hold secrets that could shift the balance of power in the city. The Riccis had been searching for it. So had he. Vittorio was accusing him of finding it first and hiding it. The accusation was a lie, but it was a dangerous one. Luca was about to deliver a response that would end the conversation, and possibly Vittorio's night, when a disturbance rippled through the onlookers. A flushed Englishman was pushing his way forward, dragging the woman from the shadows with him. The scholar, the Englishman Albright, began to stammer in broken textbook Italian. Signor De Luca, a pleasure, we were hoping for a word. Luca waved a dismissive hand, his eyes still locked on Vittorio. This was not the time for museum pleasantries. But Vittorio, sensing an audience, saw his chance. He gestured grandly at Albright. You see, the whole world comes to kiss your ring, but they don't know you're a common thief. Mr. Albright looked utterly lost, turning to the woman with a helpless expression. Sophia, what is he saying? Something about a thief? Luca watched her. Her eyes widened behind her mask. He saw the flicker of understanding, the shock of recognition. She knew the dialect. Impossible. It was a language of the docks and the back alleys, of families whose roots were sunk deep in the city's bloody mud. It wasn't taught in schools. It was inherited, like a scar. And then, she did the impossible. She stepped forward, her posture suddenly straight, her chin lifted. She looked directly at Vittorio Ricci, and a voice that was cool, clear, and utterly fluent sliced through the tension. Con rispetto, signore. Credo che ci sia un malinteso, she said, her accent flawless, the cadence perfect. With respect, sir, I believe there is a misunderstanding. She didn't just translate, she mediated. She softened the edges of Vittorio's accusation while preserving its core, rephrasing it as a passionate claim rather than a direct insult. The entire room fell silent. Not just their little circle, but the entire, vast ballroom. The music seemed to fade. The clinking of glasses stopped. Every eye turned to her, to the Englishwoman who spoke the language of secrets. Vittorio Ricci was so stunned he took a physical step back, his jaw slack. He stared at her as if she were a ghost. But Luca didn't look at Vittorio. His entire world had narrowed to the woman in the blue dress. Who was she? What was she? The dialect she had used wasn't just fluent. It was archaic. She spoke it like his grandfather had, with a purity that had been lost to time. It was the Italian of whispered confessions and deathbed promises. For the first time in a decade, Luca De Luca was completely, utterly surprised. 1,000 possibilities exploded in his mind. Was she a plant? A spy from another family, more clever than the Riccis? A government agent? Her file, if she had one, would be on his desk by morning. But that was hours away. Now, in this moment, she was an unknown variable, a beautiful, dangerous enigma who had just revealed a skill that made her either the most valuable asset in Venice or the most significant threat he had ever faced. He saw the realization of what she had done dawn on her face. The confidence drained away, replaced by a stark, naked fear. Her eyes met his, and in them, he saw a cornered animal. She was smart. She knew she had just crossed a line she could never uncross. He gave a slow, deliberate smile. It wasn't a smile of warmth or humor. It was a smile of possession, of fascination, of absolute, chilling intent. He leaned back slightly, his gaze never leaving her, and spoke a quiet command to the man at his side. The words were soft, barely a breath, but they carried the weight of an iron gate slamming shut. Marco, non lasciarla andare. Don't let her go.
The world dissolved into a pinpoint of light, and at its center were Luca De Luca's eyes. They weren't just dark, they were absolute, pulling everything into them, leaving no room for escape. His words, non lasciarla andare, weren't a shout. They were quieter than that. They were the sound of a key turning in a lock, the final metallic click of a trap springing shut. Panic, cold and sharp, speared through Sophia's chest. Her breath caught, a tiny, useless gasp. Her carefully constructed world of quiet academics and predictable routines had just been leveled by a single sentence. She had to get out. Now. She took a half step back, a clumsy, jerky motion. A mountain moved to block her path. He was huge, the man Luca had called Marco. Not fat, but dense with muscle, his shoulders straining the fabric of his tuxedo. His face was a stoic mask of polite impassivity, but his eyes were like chips of granite, hard and unmoving. He didn't touch her. He simply stood there, an immovable object, his presence a wall she could never hope to breach. "Signorina," he said, his voice a low, calm rumble that did nothing to soothe the frantic drumming of her heart. "If you would please come with me." It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact, like saying the tide would come in or the sun would rise. Mr. Albright sputtered beside her, his face a confused mess of pink and white. "I say, what's all this? Sophia, is there a problem?" Sophia couldn't find her voice. It was trapped somewhere in her throat, strangled by fear. She looked past the human wall to Luca. He was already turning away, dismissing Vittorio Ricci with a flick of his wrist, the king who had finished with his courtier. He didn't even glance back at her. He had given his order. For him, it was already done. She was a piece on his board, and he had just moved her. "Never touch them, tesoro mio. Don't let them touch you." Nonna's voice was a frantic whisper in her soul. For 28 years, Sophia had lived by her grandmother's rules. She had built a quiet life, a small life. She chose a profession that put her in contact with the dead, with the silent, beautiful ghosts of history, not with the living, breathing monsters of the present. She'd come to Venice to fulfill a promise to her nonna, to work on the great Italian masters, to feel the connection to the heritage her grandmother had left behind. But she had also made another promise, a silent one, to stay invisible, to keep her head down. And tonight, in one moment of instinctual stupid pride, she had lit a flare in the darkest corner of Venice. She had spoken the words Nonna had taught her in hushed tones, the language that was supposed to be her armor. La lingua è la tua armatura, her nonna would say, her hands kneading dough in their small London kitchen, the air thick with the smell of yeast and rosemary. Ma a volte, tesoro mio, il silenzio è la tua fortezza. But sometimes, my treasure, silence is your fortress. She had abandoned her fortress, and now the armor was a cage. Signorina? Marco's voice was closer now, still polite but with a new edge of insistence. Sophia finally found a sliver of her voice. Where are you taking me? Somewhere safe, he replied, and the word safe had never sounded so terrifying. She was led away, a ghost in the vibrant, swirling party. No one seemed to notice, or if they did, they were wise enough to look away. Mr. Albright called her name once, a reedy, confused sound that was swallowed by the music. She was already gone, erased from the glittering scene as if she had never been there at all. They didn't go out the grand entrance. They took a side door, one she hadn't noticed, that opened onto a small private dock. The damp, salty air of the canal was a shock after the stuffy heat of the palazzo. A sleek, black water taxi bobbed silently, its engine a low thrum. As Marco guided her onto the boat, his hand firm on her elbow, she looked back at the palazzo. Its windows blazed with golden light, a fairy tale palace she had foolishly wandered into. She thought of her small apartment, her books, the half-finished canvas replica she practiced on in the evenings. She thought of the smell of turpentine and linseed oil, the quiet scrape of her tools, a life of peace, a life she had just lost. The boat pulled away from the dock, gliding into the dark liquid embrace of the Grand Canal, and Sophia Bennett felt like she was descending into the underworld.
Luca watched the small black boat disappear into the night before he turned his attention back to the cloying charade inside. Vittorio Ricci was gone, having scurried away after his public humiliation. Good. The jackal had been put back in his place, albeit by the most unexpected of circumstances. Everything is handled, Marco's voice murmured in his ear a few moments later, having returned as silently as he'd left. She is on her way to the palazzo. Luca nodded, taking a flute of champagne from a passing waiter. He didn't drink it. He just held it, the cool glass a focal point in a room buzzing with heat and noise. Have you ever heard a foreigner speak the old tongue like that, Marco? Never, Marco said. There was a hint of concern in his voice. She spoke it better than my own mother. It was unsettling. Unsettling is the word, Luca agreed, his eyes scanning the room, his mind already miles away, in the boat with the woman, Sophia Bennett, art historian, from London, on a 6-month contract. That was the surface. It was a good surface. Clean, academic, unassuming. It was the perfect cover. The problem was what lay beneath. No art historian learned that dialect. It was the language of blood feuds and back-alley deals, a tongue that carried the weight of centuries of secrets. You didn't learn it from a book. You learned it at your grandfather's knee while he cleaned a blade. For her to speak it with such purity, it meant she was connected. It meant someone had taught her. The question was who, and more importantly, why? The Riccis will see this as a new move on our part, Marco stated, ever the pragmatist. They'll think she is one of ours, a secret weapon we just unveiled. Let them, Luca said, a cold smile touching his lips. Let them chase their own tails. It will keep them busy. He left the gala without another word, Marco clearing a path through the fawning crowd. The cool night air on his private dock was a relief. As his own boat cut through the dark water, the city of Venice slid by, a beautiful, decaying jewel box. He loved this city. He loved its history, its brutal, glorious past. It was in his blood, in the very marrow of his bones. His family hadn't just lived in Venice for 500 years. They were part of its foundations, for better or for worse. It was a legacy he carried every single day, a crown of shadows. He was expected to be ruthless, to be cunning, to be 10 steps ahead of his enemies. He could not afford surprises. And Sophia Bennett was the biggest surprise of his life. Back in his family's palazzo, a fortress of marble and history on a secluded canal, he didn't go to see his new guest. Not yet. He let her wait. He let her wonder. Fear was a tool, and he needed her sharp with it when they finally spoke. Instead, he went to his library. This was his sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of dark, polished wood groaned under the weight of priceless books and ancient scrolls. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and whiskey. This room was the only place he felt he could breathe, the only place he was not just the Don, but himself. Luca, the historian. The man who was as fascinated by the fall of the Venetian Republic as he was by the rise of his own empire. He poured himself a drink and walked to a large framed map on the wall, a hand-drawn depiction of Venice from the 16th century. The city was a maze of families, their territories marked, their alliances and rivalries noted in faded ink. De Luca, Ricci, Contarini, and others, names that had been wiped from the history books by time and violence. He thought of her words, the specific cadence, the archaic phrasing. It wasn't just old. It was localized. It belonged to a very specific part of the city, a sestiere that had been dominated by one family for centuries before they vanished. Marco, he said into his phone, his eyes tracing the faded name on the map. The background check on Sophia Bennett. I don't just want her history, I want her families. Go back as far as you can. Parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. I want to know the name of the dirt they were buried in. There was a pause. You think she's connected to one of the old families? I think, Luca said softly, his finger resting on a name that hadn't been spoken aloud in his family for 100 years, that no one learns a language like that by accident. It's a legacy, and I want to know who left it to her. He hung up, the silence of the library wrapping around him. The stolen painting, the Ricci's pathetic accusations, it was all just noise. The real mystery, the real prize, was the English art historian currently sitting in his guest suite, a woman who spoke the language of ghosts. And he, Luca De Luca, was going to make her talk.
The silence was the worst part. It was a thick, heavy blanket of silence that smothered every other sound. Sophia sat on the edge of a bed draped in silk sheets the color of clotted cream, in a room so opulent it felt like a museum exhibit. A gilded cage. The floors were cool marble under her stockinged feet. The walls were covered in deep blue damask, and a massive Murano glass chandelier hung from the ceiling like a frozen explosion of light. But the windows didn't open, and just outside the heavy, carved wooden door, she knew a guard stood as silent and still as a statue. Hours had passed since she'd been brought here. Hours spent listening to the frantic thumping of her own heart, replaying the moment she'd spoken those fatal words. What a fool she'd been. A proud, arrogant fool. She had wanted to show them, to show him, that she wasn't just some helpless Englishwoman. And in doing so, she had proven she was the most helpless of all. She clutched the small, cool locket she always wore around her neck. It had been her nonna's, a simple silver oval with a faded floral engraving. It was her only real link to her grandmother, to the past she knew so little about. Non farti notare, her nonna had warned her 1,000 times. Don't get noticed. It was the mantra of her life. The door opened. Sophia's head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat. It was him. Luca De Luca. He'd taken off his mask. The sight of his full face was a physical blow. He was more devastatingly handsome than she could have imagined, and it made him 1,000 times more terrifying. His face was all sharp angles and severe lines, a high brow, a straight, aristocratic nose, a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of dark, bitter coffee, and they missed nothing. They swept over her, not with lust, but with a cold, calculating assessment that stripped her bare. He closed the door behind him, the soft click echoing in the cavernous room like a gunshot. He wore no jacket now, just a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing tanned skin and a ridiculously expensive-looking watch. He moved with a liquid grace, a predator in his own territory, and she was the foreign creature trapped within it. "Sophia Bennett," he said. Her name in his mouth sounded like an accusation. His voice was a low, smooth baritone, laced with the faintest rasp of gravel. "The quiet art historian from London, here to restore the beauty of my city." He walked around the room, not looking at her directly, but she felt his gaze on her like a physical touch. He picked up a small porcelain bird from a side table, turning it over in his long, graceful fingers. "You have caused quite a stir," he continued, his tone conversational, almost pleasant. It was the calm at the center of a hurricane. Vittorio Ricci left the party with his tail between his legs. "He thinks I have a new secret weapon." He placed the bird back down with meticulous care. "Do I, Signorina Bennett? Are you my weapon?" Sophia found her voice, though it was thin and shaky. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just a translator. I work for the museum." He finally turned to face her, and the full force of his attention was staggering. "Don't lie to me." The words were soft, but they carried the unyielding weight of command. "My museum contacts say you are a brilliant restorer. They say nothing of you being a translator. They say your Italian is academic, formal. What I heard tonight was not formal. It was the language of the stones of this city. It was the language of my grandfather." He took a step closer, and another, until he was standing right in front of her. She had to crane her neck to look up at him, the scent of expensive cologne and clean linen overwhelming her senses. "So, I will ask you one time, and one time only," he murmured, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "Who are you? And where did you learn to speak like a ghost?" This was it. The precipice. Her mind raced, a frantic scramble for a way out. She could lie, invent a story about a long-lost tutor. But his eyes, those eyes would see right through it. She could tell him the truth, the little she knew of it, that her Nonna was from Venice and taught her everything, that she was full of secrets and warnings. But that would only deepen the mystery, pull her further into his world. She chose the only path she could see, a sliver of honesty wrapped in a shield of omission. "My grandmother," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "She was from here. She taught me." Luca's eyes narrowed. "Your grandmother. What was her name?" "Eleanor Bennett," Sophia said, giving her Nonna's married English name, a name that meant nothing here. "She passed away years ago." He was silent for a long moment, studying her face, searching for the lie. She felt like a canvas under his inspection, every brushstroke, every tiny flaw being analyzed. "A grandmother from Venice," he said slowly, skepticism dripping from every syllable. "How sentimental." He seemed to accept it for now. He turned away, walking towards the vast window that overlooked a private, moonlit garden. Sophia let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "The argument you so skillfully interrupted," he said, his back to her. "Do you know what it was about?" "No," she said quickly. Too quickly. He turned back, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "It was about a painting, a local legend. Perhaps you've heard of it in your studies? It's called l'allegoria velata, the veiled allegory. The blood drained from Sophia's face. The air in her lungs turned to ice. It couldn't be. It was impossible. Of all the paintings in all of Italy, the veiled allegory, the lost masterpiece by Bellini, the very reason she was in Venice, the subject of her 6-month project, the pinnacle of her entire career was to consult on its history and restoration, a project so secret that only she and Mr. Albright knew its full scope. And this man, this dangerous, terrifying man, was fighting over it in the back rooms of a Venetian palazzo. She must have made a sound, a tiny gasp, or maybe her shock was written so plainly on her face it was like a scream, because his cold, knowing smile widened. "Ah," he said softly, a note of dark satisfaction in his voice. "So you have heard of it." In that moment, Sophia understood. She hadn't just stumbled into a Mafia dispute. She had fallen into the very heart of the mystery she had come here to solve. The invisible line she'd crossed at the party wasn't just between safety and danger. It was between her quiet academic past and a violent present that was inextricably tangled with the one thing she loved most in the world. And Luca De Luca was standing right in the middle of it all.
He watched her from the security monitors in his library, a glass of amber whiskey swirling in his hand. She was pacing the guest suite like a caged animal, a very beautiful, very frightened animal. But there was steel in her spine. He'd seen it when she faced him. Fear, yes, but not submission. It was intriguing. The preliminary report from Marco lay on his desk. Sophia Bennett, age 28, top of her class at the Courtauld Institute of Art. A quiet, almost reclusive life. No romantic entanglements of note. No debts. No vices. On the surface, she was pristine. A blank canvas. But Luca knew better. No one was a blank canvas. Everyone had secrets. Hers just happened to be spoken in a dead tongue. He'd let her stew for precisely 2 hours, long enough for the initial adrenaline to fade, to be replaced by the gnawing dread of uncertainty. Then he went to her. Walking into the room, he felt the atmosphere shift. It was charged with her fear, a tangible thing in the air. When he saw her face properly, without the obstruction of a mask, he felt an unexpected jolt. She was even more striking than he'd thought. Not in the flashy, overt way of the women who usually threw themselves at him. Hers was a quieter beauty. Wide, expressive eyes the color of moss after a rain. A full mouth that was currently pressed into a thin, determined line. And a visible intelligence that was both challenging and appealing. An unwelcome flicker of heat stirred deep within him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. He immediately crushed it. This woman was not an object of desire. She was a problem to be solved. He played his part, the calm, calculating interrogator. He circled her, watched her, letting the silence do most of the work. He saw the terror in her eyes, but he also saw the frantic, intelligent mind working behind them, searching for an escape route. "Are you my weapon?" he asked, enjoying the way she flinched. Her denial was expected. Weak. He pressed, getting to the heart of it, the dialect. "My grandmother," she'd said. It was the most logical lie, the easiest one to tell because it was probably rooted in some kind of truth. He didn't believe for a second that Eleanor Bennett was the whole story, but it was a start, a thread. He would let Marco pull on that thread until it unraveled everything. But he had another tool at his disposal. A better one. A truth that would serve as a key. He walked to the window, feigning disinterest. He let the tension build again before he played his card. L'allegoria velata. He turned just in time to see it. The mask of composure didn't just crack, it shattered. For one perfect, unguarded second, he saw pure, unadulterated shock on her face. A deer-in-the-headlights terror that was completely different from the fear she'd shown before. This wasn't the fear of a captive. This was the fear of someone whose entire world had just been turned inside out. "Got you." A dark, triumphant satisfaction flowed through him. His instincts had been right. She was connected, not just to the dialect, but to the painting, the centerpiece of the entire conflict with the Ricci's, the key to a 100-year-old secret his family had been trying to unlock for generations. He savored the moment, the way the blood drained from her face, the way her beautiful eyes widened in panic. "So you have heard of it," he said, letting the words hang in the air. She was no longer just a linguistic puzzle. She was no longer just a potential spy or an inconvenient witness. She was the key. He didn't know how, he didn't know why. But this quiet English art historian held the answer to the question his family had been asking for a century. And he, Luca de Luca, was not going to let her go until he had it. The game had just changed, and Sophia Bennett was now the most important piece on the board.
The name of the painting hung in the air between them, a tangible thing, heavy and cold. L'allegoria velata, the veiled allegory. Her shock was a raw, open wound, and she knew he could see it. He could see everything. She had to regain control, had to stitch the mask of the detached academic back onto her face before he could peer directly into her soul. She forced a breath into her lungs. "Yes," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I've heard of it. It's a seminal lost work by Giovanni Bellini, a subject of much debate among art historians. Why would Signor Ricci accuse you of stealing a painting that hasn't been seen in a century?" She infused her tone with professional curiosity, a scholar discussing a fascinating hypothesis. Luca's dark eyes glittered with something that looked like amusement. He knew what she was doing. He was letting her play her part. "Because the Ricci's are sentimental fools," he said smoothly, walking back towards her. "They believe fairy tales. They think the painting is a map to some long-lost treasure, an old family myth." He stopped just a foot from her, and the space between them crackled with unspoken energy. "But you and I, we are not sentimental, are we, Signorina Bennett? We are historians. We deal in facts." He tilted his head. "So tell me a fact. What is your professional interest in this particular fairy tale?" The interrogation had begun. It wasn't with threats or violence, but with sharp, pointed questions wrapped in silk. And so, her gilded imprisonment started. She wasn't locked in a dungeon. She was a guest in the De Luca Palazzo. A guest who couldn't leave, whose phone had been politely taken for security reasons, and whose every move was watched. Her days took on a strange, surreal rhythm. She was given the full run of his magnificent library, a room that made her art historian heart ache with a pleasure so intense it was almost pain. It was a sanctuary and a prison, filled with first editions and priceless manuscripts. It was here, amongst the ghosts of poets and philosophers, that he would come to her. Their conversations were never simple. They were verbal duels fought across a landscape of art history. He'd pull a book from a shelf, open it to a page, and question her about a specific artist's technique, his eyes boring into her, searching for any inconsistency in her story. One afternoon, he found her staring at a small, dark painting in a corner, a portrait of a Renaissance nobleman. "You approve?" he asked from the doorway. Sophia jumped, her hand flying to her chest. He moved so silently. "It's a masterpiece," she breathed, turning back to the canvas. "The use of chiaroscuro is reminiscent of early Titian, but the brushwork on the lace collar, it's finer, more detailed. It's not Titian." "No," he said, coming to stand beside her. She was intensely aware of his closeness, of the warmth radiating from his body. "It is Giorgione, one of the few authenticated portraits he ever painted. My family has owned it for 400 years. It's magnificent," she whispered, her professional awe momentarily eclipsing her fear. "Look at the way he captured the subject's melancholy. It's in the eyes, the slight downturn of the mouth. It's a soul on canvas. You see that, do you?" His voice was different, softer. The hard, interrogating edge was gone, replaced by a note of genuine curiosity. "How could anyone not?" she replied, turning to look at him. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on the painting. a flicker of something vulnerable in their depths. In that moment, he wasn't the feared Mafia boss. He was a man who loved art as deeply as she did. A shared language more profound than any dialect passed between them. The captor and the captive, united in their reverence for a piece of history. The line between them blurred, becoming hazy and dangerously indistinct. But the moments of connection were always shattered by the reality of her situation. He still didn't trust her. She could feel it. He saw her as a puzzle, and her knowledge was simply another piece he was trying to fit. The breaking point came a week into her confinement. Marco, the silent mountain, informed her that Signor De Luca had permitted her an hour of fresh air in the palazzo's walled garden. It was a claustrophobic's paradise, a riot of jasmine and roses hemmed in by stone walls 20 feet high. She walked along the gravel paths, breathing in the fragrant air, tilting her face to the weak Venetian sun. For a few precious minutes, she almost felt free. She was tracing the outline of a carved bird on a stone fountain when she heard it. A strange, sharp whistle, followed by the thwack of something hitting the stone wall just inches from her head. A spray of dust and marble chips stung her cheek. She froze, her mind unable to process what had just happened. Then she saw the small, star-shaped crater in the stone. A bullet hole. Before she could scream, an arm like a steel band wrapped around her waist, yanking her backwards with brutal force. She was slammed against a hard body, her face pressed into the crisp cotton of a man's shirt. Luca. He threw them both to the ground behind the thick base of the fountain, shielding her with his own body as another shot ricocheted off the stone above them. "Stay down!" he roared, his voice a terrifying primal sound she had never heard before. It was the growl of a panther protecting its territory. His men were suddenly everywhere, shouting in Italian, guns drawn, fanning out through the garden. Sophia lay trembling beneath him, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. The smell of him, cologne, ozone, and pure, undiluted fury, filled her senses. He was heavy, solid, a human shield. And all she could think, in that moment of stark terror, was that she had never felt so safe in her entire life.
Suspicion was a bitter taste in Luca's mouth. It was a constant companion, the price of his name and his position. And Sophia Bennett was the most suspicious thing to enter his life in years. Marco's investigation into her grandmother had hit a wall. Eleanor Bennett, née Martin, married a British soldier after the war, moved to London, died of natural causes. The records were clean, too clean. It was the perfect, unremarkable history for someone trying to hide. The thread had been cut. This only hardened his belief that Sophia was not what she seemed. An operative, then, a highly skilled one, trained in linguistics and art history, sent by an unknown rival to infiltrate his world. The Ricci's weren't smart enough to orchestrate something this sophisticated. So who was she working for? This theory, this cold, hard logic, was the only thing that kept him grounded. Because every time he was near her, his logic failed him. He'd told himself his visits to the library were interrogations. He was probing for weaknesses, for slips of the tongue. But he found himself staying longer than necessary, drawn into debates about the Venetian school versus the Florentine Renaissance. He watched the way her eyes lit up, the way her hands moved as she described the curve of a sculpture, the passion that radiated from her. It was a pure, unfeigned passion, and it mirrored a part of himself he kept buried so deep, most people didn't know it existed. It was disarming. It was dangerous. He felt an unwelcome pull, a desire to know the woman, not just the puzzle. He wanted to see her smile, a real smile, not the trembling, fearful curve of her lips he sometimes saw. This desire was a weakness he could not afford. It made him angry. Angry at her for creating it, and angrier at himself for feeling it. Then came the afternoon in the garden. He had been watching her from his office window, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. Letting her outside, even in the walled garden, felt like a risk. When he saw the glint of light from a window on the palazzo across the canal, a window that should have been empty, his blood ran cold. He was moving before the first shot was fired, driven by an instinct so powerful it bypassed thought. The image of her standing by the fountain, so unaware, so vulnerable, was burned into his mind. The sound of the bullet striking stone was a physical blow. All the cold calculation, all the suspicion, evaporated in a blast of white-hot rage. The only thought in his head was protect. He covered her body with his, the soft feel of her trembling beneath him a stark contrast to the violence erupting around them. He heard the second shot, felt the vibration as it hit the fountain. Someone was trying to kill her. Someone was trying to take his key, his guest. The fury that surged through him was immense, a tidal wave of possessive, violent rage. How dare they? How dare they attack someone under his protection, in his home? It was an act of war. As his men secured the area, he pushed himself up, pulling her to her feet. Her face was pale, a smudge of dirt on her cheek where a marble chip had hit her. Her wide, moss-green eyes were filled with shock and terror. He saw the small, bleeding scratch on her cheek and his vision went red. He reached out, his thumb gently brushing away a speck of dust, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You're hurt," he said, his voice rough. She just stared at him, her body still trembling. She wasn't looking at him like a captive anymore. She was looking at him like a savior, and that, he realized with a sinking feeling, was far more dangerous than her fear. He barked orders at Marco, his voice returning to its normal, cold command. "Double the perimeter guards. I want the shooter's location swept. I want a name by midnight." He turned back to Sophia, his expression hardening again, the mask of the dawn sliding back into place. He had to re-establish the distance between them. "This is why you are not free to go," he said, his tone harsh. "The world outside these walls is not safe for you. As of now, you will be moved to the suite adjoining my own. You will not leave it without my direct permission." He was her jailer. He was her protector. He was the man who held her life in his hands, and the man who was becoming increasingly terrified that he was beginning to value that life far more than he should. The war with the Ricci's had just escalated, and Sophia Bennett, his beautiful, enigmatic prisoner, was now standing at the very center of the storm.
The suite adjoining Luca's was another cage, albeit one of breathtaking luxury. This one was decorated in shades of silver and storm cloud gray, with a balcony that overlooked the same walled garden where she had almost died. The glass doors were locked. A new guard, a man whose face was a roadmap of old scars, was stationed permanently outside her door. She was closer to Luca than ever, and had never felt more like a prisoner. The scratch on her cheek was a constant reminder of her terrifying new reality. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a different woman, not the quiet academic, but a haunted figure with fear-widened eyes. Luca had saved her life. He had shielded her with his own body. The memory of his weight, the solid, living warmth of him, was branded into her mind. It was a terrifyingly intimate memory, a moment of profound safety found in the arms of her captor. The contradiction was tearing her apart. He seemed to be wrestling with his own demons. His visits to her new quarters were less frequent, but more intense. He would stand by the locked balcony doors, staring out at the garden, his broad shoulders tight with tension. The professional interrogator was gone, replaced by a man who seemed to be at war with himself. "The Ricci's are getting bolder," he told her one evening, his voice a low growl. "The shot was a message. They know you're important to me." Important to him. The word sent a treacherous shiver down her spine. Did he mean she was important as a key? A puzzle? Or something more? She didn't dare ask. To keep her occupied, and perhaps to further his own investigation, he had provided her with a secure tablet. It contained access to a portion of the DeLuca digital archives, specifically everything related to Giovanni Bellini and the scant historical mentions of La Liguria Velata. Perhaps seeing the context will jog your memory about why a simple art historian knows so much, he'd said, his voice laced with the old familiar suspicion. So she lost herself in the work. It was her only escape. For hours, she pored over digitized manuscripts and high-resolution photographs, the familiar world of academic research a balm to her frayed nerves. She studied the image of the painting, a replica created from historical descriptions for the 100th time. A woman, her face veiled, holding a silver locket in one hand and a single withered rose in the other. It was an allegory for lost love, or lost time, or so the scholars believed. Her eyes drifted from the central figure to the ornate gilded frame depicted in the replica, and then she saw it. It was minuscule, a detail so small it was almost invisible, hidden in the scrollwork of the bottom right corner, a tiny symbol etched into the gold leaf. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hand flew to her own neck, her fingers closing around the familiar cool silver of her nonna's locket. With trembling hands, she took it off, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She held the locket next to the tablet. The floral engraving on its surface, faded with time, was a perfect, undeniable match to the symbol on the painting's frame. A stylized rose, entwined with a thorny stem. A coincidence? It couldn't be. Her nonna's locket, the one thing she had of her past, was connected to this lost masterpiece. The painting Luca de Luca and the Ricci family were willing to kill for. A frantic energy seized her. This was the thread, the real one. She dove back into the archives, her fingers flying across the tablet's screen. She bypassed the art history files and entered a search for the symbol itself. The system blocked her at first, access restricted, but her academic skills kicked in. She tried variations, cross-referencing keywords from unrestricted documents, until a side door in the archive's firewall cracked open. A single, heavily redacted document appeared, a family ledger from the early 20th century. Most of it was just numbers and names, but there, next to a large transaction, was the symbol, and beside it, a name. Bellini. The air left her lungs in a rush. Bellini, the artist. But this wasn't a record of an art purchase. This was listed under territorial disputes. Her blood ran cold. She pushed further, her mind racing. What was her nonna's maiden name? Martin? Anglicized, perhaps? From Martino? No, that didn't fit. She had never known. Her grandmother had always been a closed book about her life before England. Il passato è morto e sepolto, tesoro mio. Lascialo stare. The past is dead and buried, my treasure. Let it be. She found another file, this one buried even deeper, its security classification so high it must have been an oversight that she could access it at all. The title was simple. La Question Bellini, The Bellini Matter, dated 1923. She opened it. It wasn't a ledger, it was a report. A cold, clinical internal report detailing the swift and brutal annihilation of the entire Bellini family, a rival dynasty, for acts of treachery against the De Lucas. It spoke of an ambush, a palazzo set aflame. It listed names, ages, men, women, children. It concluded with a chillingly simple sentence. La linea Bellini è estinta. The Bellini line is extinct. Sophia felt the world tilt on its axis. The room swam before her eyes. The dialect her nonna had taught her. It wasn't just a Venetian dialect. It was the specific, archaic tongue of the Bellini Sestiere, the district described in the report. Her nonna's warnings, the constant fear of being noticed, the fierce insistence on silence and invisibility. Her nonna wasn't a paranoid old woman. She was a survivor, the sole survivor of a massacre. And the man who had ordered the report, the man whose signature was at the bottom of the page, was Luca's great-grandfather. The tablet slipped from her numb fingers and clattered onto the marble floor. She was the last of the Bellini line. She was the heir to a family the De Lucas had tried to wipe from the face of the earth, and she was living in their palace, being protected by the great-grandson of the man who had murdered her entire family. The irony was a physical sickness, rising in her throat like bile. The man who had saved her life was the heir to the man who had destroyed it. A raw, guttural sound ripped from her chest, a sob of grief and rage, and a century of buried pain. The door to her suite burst open. Luca stood there, gun in hand, his face a mask of alarm. The guard was right behind him. "What is it? What happened?" he demanded, his eyes sweeping the room for a threat. But the threat was him. The threat was the blood that ran in his veins. She rose to her feet, trembling, her eyes blazing with a hatred so pure and potent it was incandescent. She pointed a shaking finger at him. "You," she choked out, the single word filled with 100 years of accusation. "Your family. You didn't just kill them. You erased them." He stared at her, his confusion clear. "What are you talking about?" "The Bellini family," she screamed, the name feeling both foreign and intimately familiar on her tongue. "Mia familia. My family." She saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the dawning horror. He knew the name. Of course he knew the name. It was the cornerstone of his family's bloody legacy. In that moment of shared, devastating revelation, the space between them collapsed. The centuries of secrets, the lies, the blood, all of it crashed down upon them. He took a step towards her, his expression shattering, the cold mask of the dawn gone, replaced by a raw human shock. The anger, the grief, the terror, the twisted, unwanted safety she felt with him, it all coalesced into one desperate, undeniable truth. This man, this beautiful, dangerous man, was both her damnation and her only salvation. And the passion that had been simmering beneath the surface, the forbidden current of attraction, ignited in the crucible of their shared bloody history, consuming everything in its path.
The sound from her room was not a scream of fear. It was something deeper, more primal, a sound of a soul tearing in half. Luca was through the door before his guard could even react, his weapon drawn, his mind flashing to the Ricci's, to another assassin, another attack. He found her standing in the middle of the room alone. The tablet was on the floor, its screen cracked. But the threat wasn't external. It was radiating from her. She was trembling, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask of pure fury. And her eyes, her beautiful green eyes were burning with a hatred that was ancient and profound. It was aimed directly at him. "You," she said, and the venom in that one word hit him like a physical blow. "Your family. You didn't just kill them. You erased them." He was lost. What was she talking about? The Bellini family, Mia Familia. The name struck him like a bolt of lightning. Bellini. A name whispered like a curse in his family's history. The great betrayers. The family his great-grandfather had been forced to remove, to secure the De Luca future. A story of treachery and righteous justice he had been told since he was a boy. A closed chapter. A ghost story. He looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, at the absolute conviction on her face, and the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying, world-altering clarity. The dialect. Her impossible knowledge. Her grandmother, the lone survivor who had fled to England, erasing her past, hiding her last living legacy from the men who had destroyed her world. His carefully constructed theories about her being a spy, an operative, a pawn for another family. They were all wrong. So spectacularly, idiotically wrong. She wasn't a pawn. She was the ghost, the last Bellini, the living embodiment of his family's darkest secret. He had brought his history's greatest enemy into his home, placed her under his protection, and felt a pull towards her that defied every law of his universe. "It's not possible," he breathed, the words hollow in the suddenly silent room. The Bellini line was extinct. It was the foundation upon which his family's modern power was built. "Your great-grandfather's report was incomplete," she spat, her voice dripping with scorn. "One of them got away, my nonna. She survived, and she taught me everything. She taught me the language of my ancestors so I would never forget, even when I didn't know what I was remembering." He stared at her, his mind reeling. The implications were staggering. If she was a Bellini, then l'Allegoria velata. It wasn't just a painting. It was her birthright. The treasure the Riccis were chasing wasn't gold or jewels. It was the legacy of a dead family, and she was the last living piece of it. His suspicion had been a shield, a wall to keep the unwelcome attraction he felt for her at bay. Now that wall was obliterated. He wasn't looking at a puzzle to be solved. He was looking at a woman whose history was so tragically and violently intertwined with his own that they were like two sides of the same bloody coin. He took a step towards her, his gun hanging forgotten at his side. He saw past the rage to the raw pain beneath. He saw the terror of a woman whose entire identity had just been detonated. And in that moment, he felt a surge of something so fierce and protective it dwarfed what he'd felt in the garden. It wasn't about protecting an asset anymore. It was about protecting her. Her grief, her rage, her fear. It all poured out of her, and he was the only one in the world who could possibly understand the weight of it. The history between their families was a chasm, but in that moment, it was also a bridge. He reached her, his hands coming up to grip her arms, not to restrain her, but to steady her, to anchor her before she flew apart. She struggled, beating against his chest with her fists, the blows weak and desperate. "I hate you," she sobbed, the words muffled against his shirt. "I hate you." "I know," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her, absorbing her fury and her sorrow. She fought him for a moment longer, and then collapsed against him, her body racked with sobs that seemed to carry a century of loss. He held her, the ghost of his family's past, the last Bellini, and felt the foundations of his world crumble to dust. The stakes weren't about power or territory anymore. They were about her. And as he stood there holding his sworn enemy in his arms, he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he would burn the world down to keep her safe.
The storm had broken. Now, in its wake, there was a fragile, terrifying calm. They were in his library, the room that had once been her prison and now felt like the only solid ground in a world that had turned to water. The cracked tablet lay on his massive oak desk, the damning report still on its screen. La linea Bellini è estinta. The Bellini line is extinct. A lie. 100-year-old lie. And she was the living proof. Luca had released her, but she hadn't moved away. She stood before him, drained of tears, feeling hollowed out as if her entire life had been a vessel for a grief she never knew she was carrying. He looked just as shattered. The cold, ruthless mask of the dawn was gone, replaced by a look of raw, unguarded turmoil. He was no longer her captor. He was the other half of this impossible, bloody story. "What my great-grandfather did," he started, his voice a low, rough rasp. "It was a different time, a different world. The story I was told was one of betrayal, that the Bellinis conspired with our enemies to destroy us." "And you believed it?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. She was too tired for anger now. "It was the history I was given," he said, running a hand through his dark hair. "It is the foundation of this house, of my life." He looked at her, and his coffee-dark eyes were filled with a century of his family's sins. "Does it matter what I believed? The truth is, my family built its future on the ashes of yours." The confession hung between them, stark and ugly. He wasn't making excuses. He was stating a fact. And in a strange, twisted way, his honesty was a comfort. "What happens now?" she whispered, the question feeling impossibly large. Before he could answer, a sharp, buzzing sound filled the silence. He glanced at the phone on his desk, his jaw tightening. He answered it, turning away from her, and spoke in low, rapid Italian. Sophia couldn't make out the words, but she heard the change in his tone. The calm was gone. A new, sharp tension entered his voice. He hung up, and when he turned back to her, a fear she had never seen in him before was flickering in his eyes. It was a stark, chilling sight. This man, who seemed to fear nothing, was afraid. "My uncle," he said, his voice tight. Matteo. He's on his way to the palazzo. He cannot find you here. He cannot know who you are. Your uncle? He is of the old world, Luca said, and the euphemism was terrifying. He believes in tradition, in finishing what was started. If he finds out a Bellini is alive, he won't see you as a woman. He will see you as a loose thread, one that must be cut. The image was brutal, clinical. Suddenly, the danger felt more immediate than a sniper's bullet. This wasn't an outside enemy like the Ricci's. This was from within. This was family. His family. You have to hide, he commanded, his authority returning. But it was laced with desperation now. He grabbed her hand, his grip firm, his skin warm against her suddenly icy fingers. He pulled her from the library through a series of corridors she had never seen until they reached a small hidden room behind a tapestry. It was little more than a closet, filled with dusty linen. Stay here, he ordered, his eyes boring into hers. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear. Do you understand me, Sophia? She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. I will protect you, he said, and it sounded less like a promise and more like a vow sworn against the entire world. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks, and for a heartbeat, his lips were inches from hers. The air was thick with unspoken things, with a desperate, impossible desire. Then he was gone, the tapestry falling back into place, plunging her into near darkness and a suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of her own terrified breathing.
Luca walked back into his library just as the heavy doors swung open to admit his uncle. Zio Matteo was a relic, a man carved from Venetian marble and hardened by a lifetime of violence. He was shorter than Luca, wiry and impeccably dressed, but he moved with the deadly stillness of a viper. His eyes, pale and cold as a winter sky, missed nothing. Nephew, Matteo said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. He surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on the two glasses on the desk, the faint scent of a woman's perfume in the air. You have a guest. It was not a question. Just some business, Luca said smoothly, moving to pour his uncle a drink. His hands were steady, a lifetime of practice at hiding his thoughts. The museum partnership. Matteo took the glass, his cold eyes never leaving Luca's. I heard about the commotion at the gala. I heard you left with the English translator. I also heard about the incident in your garden. The Ricci's grow bold, and you grow careless. The situation is under control, Luca said, his voice a low growl. Is it? Matteo took a small sip of his drink. Power, Luca, is not a possession. It is a performance. And your performance is becoming clouded. By this woman. Who is she? Luca held his uncle's gaze. He had to lie. He had to build a fortress of lies around Sophia to keep her safe. She is a tool. The Ricci's think she's important to me. I'm using that to draw them out. Matteo was silent for a long moment. He walked around the desk, his movements slow and deliberate. He glanced at the tablet, which Luca had frantically shut off. A tool. Matteo repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. You have a strange look in your eye for a man speaking of a tool. You look like a king who has found a treasure he is afraid to lose. Before Luca could respond, Marco entered the library, his face grim. He bowed his head to Matteo before speaking to Luca. Signore, there is a problem. A guard from the garden detail. He talked to one of Matteo's men. Luca's blood turned to ice. Matteo smiled, a thin, chilling expression that did not reach his eyes. It seems my people are more efficient than yours, nephew. They told me the most fascinating story about the dialect the English tool speaks. An old dialect. A forgotten one. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The dialect of the Bellinis. The trap had sprung. Matteo had known all along. He had come here for confirmation. She is nothing, Luca bit out, his control fraying. She is a ghost returned to haunt us. Matteo's voice was suddenly sharp as shattered glass. A testament to our family's failure. Your great-grandfather should have killed every last one of them. He left a root in the ground and now it has sprouted. She is an innocent woman, Luca roared, his fists clenching at his sides. There are no innocents in this life, Matteo shot back, his face contorted with a cold fury. There is only blood. Ours and theirs. The Bellini line must be extinct. That was the pact. That is the foundation of our honor. You will finish the job your great-grandfather started, Luca. Or I will. The ultimatum was absolute. It was the ancient code of their world, a code written in blood. To defy it was to declare war on his own family. To obey it was to murder the woman who had, in the space of a few short weeks, become the center of his universe. He looked at his uncle's merciless face and saw his choice. There was no choice at all. There was only one path. And it would cost him everything. He had to save her, and to do it he had to destroy her. He returned to the hidden room hours later. Sophia was huddled in the corner, her face pale with fear in the dim light. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with questions and a fragile, burgeoning trust. He had to shatter it. He had to break her heart to keep it beating. He reached down and pulled her roughly to her feet. The warmth, the desperation he'd shown earlier, was gone. His face was a mask of cold fury. His touch was like ice. You need to leave, he said, his voice flat and cruel. Luca, what is it? What did he say? She asked, her voice trembling as she searched his face for the man who had held her just hours before. He said the truth, Luca sneered, forcing the words out, each one a shard of glass in his own throat. You are a Bellini, a ghost, and this house has no room for ghosts. Her face crumpled in confusion and pain. But you said you would protect me. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Protect you? I was protecting an asset, a curiosity, but you are more than that. You are a liability, a blood feud I have no interest in fighting. My uncle is right. You are a loose thread. He saw the exact moment her heart broke. It was in the way the light died in her eyes, the way her body seemed to shrink in on itself. He was killing her, right here, with his words. I don't believe you, she whispered, her voice cracking. Believe this, he said, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in, and dragged her towards the tapestry. You were a fool to ever trust me, to trust a De Luca. Now run, get out of Venice, get out of Italy. Pray my uncle's men don't find you before the Riccis do, because I will not be there to save you again. He shoved her towards Marco, who stood waiting by a secret passage, his face a stony, unreadable mask. Marco handed her a thick envelope of cash and a burner phone. Go, Luca commanded, his voice like the crack of a whip. She looked at him one last time, her eyes swimming with a galaxy of pain and betrayal. Then she turned and disappeared into the darkness of the passage without a word. The moment she was gone, the strength left Luca's legs. He stumbled back against the wall, the mask of cruelty shattering, leaving behind a devastation so profound it felt like a physical wound. He slammed his fist into the stone wall, a choked, agonizing sound ripping from his throat. Marco reappeared from the passage, his expression grim. It is done. She is on her way to a private boat. It was the only way, Marco, Luca rasped, his knuckles bleeding, his head pressed against the cold stone. He would have killed her. He would have made me watch. I know, Marco said quietly. Luca was trapped. His uncle was watching him. The Riccis were hunting her. And Sophia, his Sophia, was out there, alone, believing he was the monster everyone had always said he was. He had pushed her out of his world to save her life, but in doing so, he had plunged them both into an abyss of utter hopelessness. He had never felt so powerful and so completely, utterly alone.
The small village in Tuscany was a watercolor painting of ochre and terracotta, a world away from the cold Gothic beauty of Venice. Here, under the warm, hazy sun, the The cypress trees stood like dark green sentinels on rolling hills. Sophia had found a room in a small, family-run albergo, paying cash from the thick envelope Marco had given her. For 3 days, she had done nothing but exist. She slept, but found no rest. Dreams haunted by the cold, cruel mask Luca's face had become. She ate, but tasted nothing, the local bread and cheese turning to ash in her mouth. She was a ghost, just as he'd called her. The last Bellini, a name that meant nothing and cost everything. Her heart was a hollow, aching cavern. The betrayal so complete it had carved out her soul. He had protected her only to destroy her. The memory of his arms around her, the feeling of safety she'd felt behind the fountain. It was all a lie. A sick, twisted game. On the 4th morning, something shifted. She woke not to the suffocating weight of despair, but to a slow, simmering spark of anger. She looked at her reflection in the small, warped mirror above the wash basin. She saw her Nona's eyes staring back at her. And her Nona had not been a victim. She had been a survivor. She had endured the unimaginable, fled her home, and built a new life, all while carrying the secret of her slaughtered family. She had armed Sophia with her language, with her stories, with her warnings. She had not raised her to run and hide. Il passato è morto e sepolto, tesoro mio. Lascialo stare. The past is dead and buried. Let it be. No. Sophia's hand went to the silver locket at her throat. The past wasn't dead. It was sleeping, and Luca De Luca had woken it up. She sat on the edge of the lumpy bed and pulled out the burner phone. Marco had, with some foresight she now appreciated, loaded it with the files from the De Luca archive she had been studying. She opened the image of l'Allegoria Velata. She wasn't just a descendant anymore. She was an art historian, and she would use her skills, the one part of her life that was truly her own, to fight back. She ignored the pain in her heart and focused her mind. The veiled allegory. Why veiled? An allegory for what? A woman holds a locket and a withered rose. Scholars said it was about lost love, a common Renaissance theme. But the artist was a Bellini, her ancestor. What if it wasn't about love? What if it was about a secret? A truth that had to be veiled for its own protection. Her gaze fell on the inscription on the frame, the one she'd deciphered from the archives. Dove l'ombra si inginocchia alla luce, la verità attende. Where the shadow kneels to the light, the truth awaits. It wasn't poetry. It was a clue. A riddle. Her Nonna had filled her childhood with riddles and old Venetian sayings. She closed her eyes, trying to summon her grandmother's voice, the cadence, the specific turns of phrase. Something about the old churches, about the way the light hit the altars at noon. L'ombra si inginocchia. The shadow kneels. It was a phrase used to describe the long, thin shadow cast by a church spire as the sun passed its zenith. Her fingers flew across the phone's small screen, searching for old maps of Venice, cross-referencing them with lists of forgotten or deconsecrated churches from the early 20th century. Her mind was sharp, focused, the grief packed away, transformed into fuel. She was no longer running from her past. She was chasing it. She was hunting for the truth. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the footsteps on the old wooden stairs. She didn't hear the door to her room creak open. She only knew she wasn't alone when a shadow fell across her phone. Her head snapped up, a scream catching in her throat. It was Luca. He looked wrecked. His suit was rumpled, his jaw was covered in dark stubble, and his eyes were hollowed out, shadowed with an exhaustion that went deeper than sleeplessness. He looked like a man who had been to hell and back. "Sophia," he breathed, his voice raw. All the anger, all the resolve she had just found, crumbled in the face of his presence. The pain came rushing back, a tidal wave of betrayal. "Get out!" she whispered, scrambling back on the bed, away from him. "Get away from me!" "Please," he said, taking a step into the room, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Just listen to me. 5 minutes. That's all I ask." "You had your chance to talk," she shot back, her voice shaking with rage. "You called me a liability, a ghost. You told me to run, so I'm running. Now leave me alone." "Everything I said that night was a lie," he said, his voice cracking with an emotion she couldn't place. "Every word was poison I forced myself to feed you." "Why?" she demanded, tears of frustration stinging her eyes. "Why would you do that?" He took another step, his face a mask of raw, agonizing vulnerability. "Because my uncle was in the next room. Because he would have had you killed, and he would have made me give the order. I had to make you hate me. I had to make you run. It was the only way I could keep you alive. I would rather you spend the rest of your life hating me and be alive than love me for another second and be dead." The confession fell into the space between them, a truth so powerful and painful it stole the air from her lungs. She stared at him, at the undisguised torment in his eyes. And she saw it. The sacrifice. The impossible, soul-crushing choice he had made. He hadn't broken her heart out of cruelty. He had broken it to save her life. The anger drained out of her, replaced by a deep, shuddering wave of emotion. He closed the distance between them, sinking to his knees in front of her, his head bowed. "I left the palazzo 2 days ago," he said, his voice muffled. "I defied my uncle. I don't care about the family or the honor or the blood. I only care about you. I have been searching for you ever since. I was going mad thinking of you out here, alone, hunted." He looked up at her then, and his eyes were swimming with unshed tears. "Forgive me, Sophia, for the pain I caused you, for the sins of my family, for everything." She reached out, her trembling hand touching his stubbled cheek. He was real. This was real. He hadn't betrayed her. He had saved her in the only way he knew how. "There's nothing to forgive," she whispered. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, and in that moment, they were no longer a DeLuca and a Bellini. They were just a man and a woman, their histories forged together in blood and grief, finding their way back to each other in a quiet room under the Tuscan sun.
The palazzo had become a mausoleum. For 2 days after Sophia was gone, Luca walked its halls feeling nothing but the suffocating weight of his own name. Zio Matteo was a constant, smiling presence, a vulture circling what he thought was a fresh kill. He watched Luca's every move, waiting for a sign of weakness. Luca gave him none. He was the Don, cold, decisive, empty. But at night, alone in his library, the ghost of her was everywhere. In the book she'd left open, in the scent of her that still lingered in the air. He stared at the portrait of his great-grandfather, the architect of all this pain, and felt a burning, corrosive hatred. This legacy, this crown of shadows he had been born to wear, was a curse. He had made his choice. He had saved her life. But what was a life without her in it? He had won the battle for her survival, but in doing so, had condemned himself to a living death. He couldn't accept it. On the third night, he stood before the portrait and made a new vow. He would not be his great-grandfather. He would not be his uncle. He would be the man Sophia had seen, the man who loved history, the man who could stand beside her. He found Marco in the security room. "Track the burner phone," he commanded. "Now, and keep it silent. No one, especially not my uncle, is to know what we are doing." Marco nodded, a look of profound relief on his face. "Where are we going, signore?" "To get her back," Luca said, his voice filled with a resolve he hadn't felt in days. "And then, we are going to finish this." The hunt was agonizing. The phone was off for long stretches. He drove through the night, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his mind filled with 1,000 terrible possibilities. The Riccis, his uncle's men. Her, alone and terrified. When the signal finally stabilized in a small Tuscan village, the relief that washed over him was so powerful his vision blurred. He found the albergo, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw her through the window of her room, bent over the phone, a look of fierce concentration on her face. She wasn't broken, she was fighting. A surge of pride and love so fierce it nearly brought him to his knees, washed over him. He confessed everything, the words pouring out of him, stripping away the armor he had worn his entire life. He knelt before her, the last Bellini, and laid his heart, his name, his entire world at her feet. When her hand touched his face, it was not just forgiveness, it was absolution. It was a new beginning. Later, after the tears had passed, after the space between them was filled not with pain, but with a deep, unbreakable bond, she showed him her work. "It's a map," she said, her voice alive with discovery. "The painting isn't the treasure, it's the key. Where the shadow kneels to the light, the truth awaits. I think it's a place, a church in Venice." He looked at the riddle, then at the old map she had pulled up, and suddenly he knew. It was a place he'd known since childhood, a place of ghost stories. "The Chiesa di San Geminiano," he breathed. "The lost church. It was torn down by Napoleon, but the crypts, the foundations, they are still there, sealed up, beneath Piazza San Marco." His eyes met hers, a wild hope dawning. "An old De Luca legend says the Bellinis had a private vault hidden beneath the city, a place no one could find. The truth awaits," Sophia whispered, her eyes shining. It was all there, the key, the location, the purpose. Together they had unlocked it. They were no longer victims of their history, they were about to become its masters. "The Riccis are tearing Venice apart looking for the painting itself," Luca said, a plan forming in his mind, sharp and clear. "They're looking for the wrong thing. My uncle is watching my every move in the city, waiting for me to make a mistake." He took her hands in his. "We go back, not as a Don and his captive, but together. We get to that vault before anyone else even knows where to look."
Venice at night was a different beast. The city she had explored as a wide-eyed academic was gone, replaced by a labyrinth of ink-black water and looming, skeletal architecture. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every splash of water against the stone foundations sounded like a footstep. She sat beside Luca in a small, nondescript motorboat, Marco at the helm, guiding them through the smaller, forgotten canals. The cold, salty air whipped at her face, a stark contrast to the warmth of Luca's hand enclosing hers. His grip was a silent promise, an anchor in the terrifying, exhilarating storm they were willingly sailing into. They weren't heading for the grand entrance of Piazza San Marco. Marco docked the boat at a small, crumbling water gate, one that looked like it hadn't been opened in a century. Using a series of heavy, rusted keys that looked as ancient as the city itself, Luca opened a thick wooden door set into the foundation of a building. "The old procurator's entrance," he murmured, his voice low. "It connects to the service tunnels beneath the square. My family has held the keys for generations. We never knew why they were so important. Until now." The air that hit them as the door swung inward was thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth, decay, and something else. The cold, sterile scent of trapped history. They descended a flight of slick, stone steps, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive darkness, a single powerful flashlight in Luca's hand cutting a path through the gloom. The tunnels were a claustrophobic's nightmare. Low, arched ceilings wept with moisture, and the stone floor was uneven and treacherous. It felt like they were walking through the city's very veins. After a few hundred yards, they came to a massive, bricked-up wall. "This is it," Luca said, his voice reverent. "The foundation of the old church." He and Marco produced pry bars and a sledgehammer from a duffel bag. The sound of the hammer striking the brick was a deafening, violent intrusion into the ancient silence. Sophia's heart hammered in time with each blow. They were literally breaking into the past. When the opening was large enough, Luca squeezed through, then reached back to help her. She stepped from a service tunnel into a crypt. The air changed immediately. It was colder, drier. Bones were stacked in niches along the walls, their hollow eye sockets watching their intrusion. This was the resting place of forgotten Venetians, and they were trespassers. "The riddle," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Dove l'ombra si inginocchia alla luce." Where the shadow kneels to the light. She scanned the crypt with her own smaller flashlight. There was no light here, no sun, no spire. It had to be symbolic. Her gaze fell upon the center of the room, a single raised sarcophagus, far more ornate than the simple niches. Carved on its lid was a knight in prayer, his stone body kneeling, and above him on the ceiling was a faint, circular fresco, almost completely faded. It depicted a sunburst. "The light," she breathed, moving towards it. "The shadow is the knight. He's kneeling to the light on the ceiling." She ran her hands over the stone knight, her fingers tracing the cold carved lines of his praying hands. There, a tiny, almost imperceptible seam at the base of the sculpture. "Luca, here." Together, they pushed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, groaning sound of stone grinding against stone, the entire lid of the sarcophagus shifted, revealing not a body, but another dark, steep flight of stairs leading even deeper into the earth. The entrance to the vault. Her ancestors had hidden their last secrets in a tomb guarded by a kneeling shadow. As they started to descend, a shout echoed from the service tunnel behind them. Italian, harsh and guttural. "Ricci," Marco growled, drawing a sleek black handgun from his jacket. "They followed us," Luca swore, his own weapon appearing in his hand as if by magic. He pushed her behind him. "Go, Sophia. Get down there. Marco and I will hold them off." "No," she cried, grabbing his arm. "We do this together." His eyes met hers, and in them, she saw a blaze of fury, fear, and a fierce, protective love that stole her breath. "They will not touch you," he vowed. Gunshots erupted in the crypt, the sound a deafening, percussive roar that shook the very bones in the walls. Marco returned fire, a deadly, efficient dance of shadows and light. Luca grabbed her hand and pulled her down the stairs, into the absolute darkness below. He slammed a heavy, iron-bound door at the bottom, just as the wood above them splintered from a bullet. He fumbled for a moment, and then a series of oil lamps flickered to life, their warm golden glow illuminating the space around them. They were in a circular chamber, its stone walls lined not with treasure chests, but with sealed metal document tubes and large leather-bound ledgers. At the very center of the room, on a velvet-draped pedestal, was a painting. L'Allegoria Velata. It was more beautiful and heartbreaking than any replica could capture. The veiled woman's sorrow was a palpable thing, her grief seeming to radiate from the canvas. Sophia reached out, her fingers hovering just above the surface, a sob catching in her throat. This was her history, her family's final desperate message. The sounds of the gunfight above faded, replaced by an ominous silence. Then, heavy footsteps descended the stairs. The door handle rattled. "It's over, DeLuca," a familiar sneering voice yelled from the other side. "Vittorio Ricci. There's nowhere left to run." Luca ignored him, his eyes scanning the ledgers on the walls. "The truth awaits," he murmured, grabbing the one marked with the Bellini rose. He ripped it open. The pages were filled with elegant, sloping script. It was a journal. He read aloud, his voice low and intense, a stark contrast to the pounding on the door. It was an account written by a Bellini artist, Sophia's ancestor. It told a story not of Bellini treachery, but of Ricci manipulation, of forged letters, of manufactured evidence. The Riccis had played their two greatest rivals against each other, whispering poison into the DeLuca ear about a Bellini plot, fanning the flames of paranoia until Luca's great-grandfather, consumed by a need to protect his own family, had acted. The Riccis had even helped, guiding the DeLuca men to the Bellini palazzo, only to set the fires themselves to ensure there were no witnesses left to refute the lies. The DeLucas were not the masterminds of the massacre. They were the weapon. The Riccis were the murderers. Then, at the back of the journal, tucked into a leather sleeve, was a folded piece of parchment. A confession, signed by Vittorio Ricci's own great-grandfather, boasting of his brilliant deception. It had been stolen from his desk by a loyal Bellini servant moments before the palazzo fell. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The truth. A truth that cleared one family and condemned another. The heavy door behind them groaned, then splintered, and crashed inwards. Vittorio Ricci stood there, a triumphant, ugly sneer on his face, flanked by his men. Marco lay slumped and bleeding at the top of the stairs. "The famous painting," Vittorio said, his eyes gleaming with greed as he stared at the canvas. "And the famous last Bellini. My, what a historic night." He leveled his gun at Sofia. "Give me the journal, De Luca. We'll burn it, along with you, and create our own history." Luca moved to stand in front of her, shielding her with his body, his own gun raised. A standoff. But they were outnumbered. It was hopeless. But as Vittorio spoke, Sofia's eyes weren't on him. They were on the ancient schematics of the vault she had seen in the journal, a diagram of the locking mechanism. It was a counterweight system, tied to the pedestal the painting rested on, a final security measure. To preserve the truth, the vessel must be sacrificed. "Luca," she whispered, her voice urgent, her eyes locked on his. "Trust me." Before he could react, she lunged sideways, not away from the danger, but towards it. She grabbed the base of the pedestal holding La Liguria Velata and, with all her strength, shoved it. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening groan, a series of massive iron bars shot down from the ceiling, slamming into place, sealing the doorway shut with a final echoing boom of iron on stone. A portcullis. They had just locked themselves in the tomb, with their enemies. Vittorio stared at the bars, then at her, his face a mask of disbelief, which quickly curdled into rage. "You foolish girl, what have you done? You've trapped us all." Sofia looked at Luca, whose face was a mirror of her own dawning realization. Then she looked back at Vittorio, and for the first time, she felt no fear. Only a cold, hard certainty. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with the authority of her ancestors. "I've trapped you."
The rage that pulsed through Luca was a living thing. Hearing the truth read from the Bellini journal, he felt a century of lies burn away, leaving behind a clarity that was as painful as it was liberating. His great-grandfather hadn't been a ruthless monster. He had been a fool. A pawn, manipulated by the craven, grasping Ricci's. The foundation of his house wasn't built on a necessary evil, but on a grotesque lie. His family's honor hadn't been preserved. It had been stolen. When Vittorio Ricci crashed through the door, Luca felt no fear, only a singular burning desire to correct the past. To spill Ricci blood on the floor of this sacred place and reclaim the truth. Marco was down. It was him and Sofia against a small army. The odds were impossible. He didn't care. He would die here, protecting her, protecting the truth. And then she moved. He saw her lunge for the painting, and for one insane second, he thought she was trying to destroy it. His heart stopped. But then he saw the look in her eyes. Not despair, but fierce, brilliant calculation. "Trust me." The sound of the iron portcullis crashing down was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of a trap being sprung. By her. Not by a warrior or a don, but by an art historian who had paid attention, who had used her knowledge, her intellect, as the deadliest weapon in the room. Ricci's face was a study in apoplectic rage. His men looked around, their bravado evaporating in the face of being buried alive. The hunter had become the hunted. "You're trapped in here with us, De Luca," Vittorio screamed, his voice pitching high with panic. "There's no way out." "That's where you're wrong, Ricci," Luca said, a slow, cold smile spreading across his face. He pointed to a small, unassuming iron ring on the far wall, a detail he had only noticed because he was looking for it, because Sophia's action told him there had to be another way. The Bellinis were smarter than you. They built a tomb, but they also built an escape. He held up the confession. This document will be your tomb, but we will not be staying for the funeral. Chaos erupted. Ricci's men, consumed by a new primal fear of being buried alive, turned on him. The standoff was broken. As they scrambled and fought amongst themselves, Luca grabbed Sophia's hand. Now, he yelled. He pulled the iron ring. With another groan of ancient machinery, a section of the stone wall ground inwards, revealing a narrow, dark passage. He shoved Sophia through it, then turned back. He saw Marco, stirring at the top of the stairs. "Marco!" he roared. His loyal friend, bleeding but alive, understood immediately. He scrambled down the stairs, firing his weapon to cover their retreat, and dove through the opening just as Luca pulled a lever on the inside of the passage. The stone door slid shut, sealing the vault and the panicked screams of Vittorio Ricci and his men inside. They were in another tunnel, this one smaller, narrower, sloping upwards. It was a long, breathless climb in near darkness. Marco was leaning heavily on him, but he was alive. Sophia was safe, her hand gripping his, her breathing ragged but steady. They emerged gasping into a place of impossible peace. The cellar of a quiet, empty church on a forgotten side canal. They had made it. They were out. He turned to Sophia in the dim light filtering through a grime-covered window. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair was a mess, but her eyes were blazing with a fire he had never seen before. She was magnificent. She was a queen. He pulled her to him, his hands tangling in her hair, and his mouth came down on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a raw, desperate claiming. It was a testament to their survival, a fusion of relief and triumph, and a love so profound it felt like it could rewrite history itself. He poured all of his awe, his gratitude, his absolute adoration for her into that kiss. She had not only saved their lives, she had reclaimed their truth. And in the dusty cellar of a forgotten church, surrounded by the ghosts of their past, Luca de Luca knew he wasn't holding a liability or a ghost. He was holding his entire future.
The silence in the church cellar was a living thing. It was broken only by their ragged breaths and the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn on the lagoon. Luca's kiss had been a cataclysm, a breaking and a mending all at once. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers, and she could feel the frantic, triumphant beat of his heart against her own. They had survived. It felt impossible. "Marco," she breathed, the reality of their situation crashing back in. They turned to where Marco leaned against a dusty wine rack, his face pale and slick with sweat, a dark stain spreading across his expensive shirt. He gave a weak, grim smile. "Just a scratch, signorina." "Like hell it is," Luca growled, all business now. He tore a strip from the hem of his own shirt, pressing it firmly against Marco's side. "We need to get you out of here." Their escape from the cellar was a blur of adrenaline and stealth. They moved through the pre-dawn city like phantoms, sticking to the shadows, Luca supporting most of Marco's weight. He led them to a small, unassuming apartment tucked away in the Cannaregio district, a place so anonymous it felt like it existed outside of time. It was a safe house, a relic from his family's old life that was now serving as the cradle for their new one. While Luca found a discreet doctor, a man with skilled hands and no questions, Sophia cleaned the grime from her face and hands in a small porcelain sink. She looked at her reflection. The same moss-green eyes, the same face. But the woman staring back was a stranger. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet strength that felt as solid and ancient as the Venetian stone. She had walked through the fire of her family's past and had not been consumed. She had been forged. When Luca returned, he found her sitting by Marco's bedside, where the doctor had finished stitching and bandaging the wound. He was sleeping, his breathing even. Luca came and stood behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders, his thumbs gently rubbing the tense muscles. "He'll be fine," he said softly. "He's too stubborn not to be." She leaned back, resting her head against his chest, closing her eyes. "And what about Vittorio and the vault?" "I sent the confession," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "A digital copy sent to a man I trust in the Carabinieri, along with an anonymous tip about a group of armed men trapped in a historical site beneath the piazza. The Ricci family will be dismantled by morning, not by a rival family's bullets, but by the law, by the truth. It was a new kind of justice, his kind, their kind." She turned, looking up at him, at the tired lines around his eyes, at the fierce devotion that burned there for her. He was no longer a king of shadows. He was a man who had chosen the light. "And your uncle?" she whispered, the last and most dangerous piece of the puzzle. His expression hardened for a moment. "I will deal with Matteo." He cupped her cheek, his touch gentle. "Sofia Bellini, you have given me the one weapon he can never defeat. You gave me a reason to build a better world."
Luca left Sofia sleeping in the safe house, the rising sun casting a pale, hopeful light across her face. He kissed her forehead, a silent vow, and slipped out into the awakening city. The final battle was not one of guns, but of wills. And for the first time in his life, he was walking into a war with absolute certainty on his side. He found his uncle in the library of the palazzo, standing exactly where Luca had known he would be, before the portrait of their ancestor. Matteo turned as he entered, a cold, questioning look in his pale eyes. "You have been out all night, nephew," Matteo said, his voice dry. "I trust you have taken care of the Bellini matter." "I have," Luca said, his voice calm and even. He walked to the desk and placed the original signed confession down on the polished wood. "I have uncovered the truth of it." Matteo's eyes flickered to the parchment. He did not need to read it. The Bellini crest, the Ricci signature, he understood instantly. He paled, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor in his hand. "Lies," he hissed. "Forged documents to save a guilty bloodline." "No," Luca said, his voice ringing with an authority that was entirely his own, forged in the crypt and tempered by his love for Sofia. "It's the truth we built our lives on a lie. We were not instruments of justice. We were the weapon in a coward's hand. Our honor, Zio, is a phantom. The Riccis murdered the Bellinis and used our family name to sign their work." "It does not matter," Matteo shot back, his composure cracking. "The Bellinis were our rivals. The outcome remains the same. We are the De Lucas. We survived." "We survived as puppets," Luca corrected him, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "And I will not be a puppet. I will not rule a kingdom built on lies and haunted by the ghosts of innocence." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over his uncle. "The old ways are done. The blood feuds, the secrets, the code of silence, it all ends. Today, I am transitioning the family's assets. Everything will be legitimate within 5 years, no more shadows, no more blood." Matteo stared at him, his face a mask of horrified disbelief. "You would dishonor our name? For a woman? For a Bellini?" "I would honor the name De Luca by making it mean something more than fear and violence," Luca said. "And yes, for her, I would burn down this world and build a new one from the ashes for her." The finality in his voice was absolute. Matteo saw it. He saw that the nephew he had tried to mold into a reflection of the past had become a man of the future. The old world was dead, and Luca had just buried it. "You have 2 hours to be on a plane," Luca said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "You will live out your days in quiet retirement in Argentina. If I ever see you in Italy again, I will not be so merciful." He was not killing his uncle. He was exiling him. It was a new kind of power. The power to give life, not just to take it. Matteo, defeated, looked from Luca's unyielding face to the confession on the desk. He looked at the portrait of their ancestor. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the library, a ghost leaving a world that no longer had a place for him. Luca stood alone in the silent room. He felt the weight of 500 years of history lift from his shoulders. He was free, and he knew exactly where he needed to go. 6 months later, the Venetian sun was warm on Sofia's face. She stood on the terrace of the palazzo, their palazzo, overlooking the Grand Canal. The city was no longer a place of fear, but a place of profound, undeniable belonging. The news of the Ricci family's spectacular implosion had been front-page news for weeks, a story of buried secrets and mafia wars that had captivated the world. And at the center of it all was the story of the lost masterpiece, l'Allegoria velata. When the authorities had unsealed the vault, they had found the painting, unharmed. After months of legal wrangling, the Italian government had declared it a national treasure, and they had asked the world's foremost expert on the piece, the woman who had uncovered its secrets, to lead its public restoration. Dr. Sofia Bellini. She had taken back her family's name. Her life's work was no longer a secret, but a celebration. She heard his footsteps behind her and smiled, not turning. She knew his presence like she knew her own heartbeat. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest, his chin resting on her shoulder. "The restoration is finished," she said softly, looking across the water. "I know," he murmured. "I saw it today at the Gallery dell'Accademia. It was beautiful, and the restorer is even more so." She turned in his arms to face him. He looked younger. The harsh lines of the dawn softened into the confident ease of a man at peace with himself. His work was just as public as hers now, the De Luca Foundation for the Arts, a new shipping company that was the talk of Europe, all clean, all legitimate. He had rebuilt his empire in the light. "It doesn't belong there, you know," he said, his dark eyes twinkling. "A Bellini masterpiece." "And where does it belong?" she asked, playing along. "It belongs here," he said, his voice dropping to that intimate, gravelly tone that still made her heart skip a beat. He gestured with his head back towards the grand salon. She followed his gaze. And there, hanging in the place of honor where his ancestor's portrait used to be, was the painting, l'Allegoria velata. He had arranged a long-term loan from the museum. He had brought her history home. The veiled woman on the canvas no longer looked sorrowful. In the warm light of the palazzo, she looked serene, her secret finally told, her truth finally free. Luca raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. He leaned in, his lips brushing her ear, and he spoke to her in the soft, intimate dialect of their ancestors. The language was no longer one of secrets and danger. It was the language of their love, of their future, of a legacy not inherited, but built together. A language of home. He had once given an order: "Don't let her go." And he never had.